buried within our most sacred texts, is a story not of faith, but of physics. A history of technology so advanced, our ancestors could only call it divine. For millennia we have been told a comforting story of our origins, of a singular God creating humanity in a perfect garden. But the original, unedited words of our ancestors tell a profoundly different and far more startling tale. This is the story of a global cataclysm that erased a world, the arrival of powerful engineers from the stars, and the genetic creation of a new species, our species, to be their workforce. Today we will decode the true, plural meaning of Elohim. We will expose the details of a secret treaty signed by President Eisenhower, not with a foreign nation, but with a non-human intelligence. And we will demonstrate how the flying machines of the Bible, the metallic kavod and the winged ruach, were systematically mistranslated into glory and spirit, hiding a history of advanced technology in a shroud of religion. This is the account of the great mistranslation, the moment our history was redacted and our memory was erased. The story you are about to hear connects the dots between forbidden archaeology, declassified files, and the source code of our oldest civilizations. The official version of the past is about to crumble. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. We are all born into a story that has already been written for us. It's a story of human history, taught in schools and repeated in documentaries, where our ancestors stumble out of caves, slowly discover fire, invent the wheel, and through a long, arduous process of trial and error, eventually build the world we live in today. In this official narrative, their beliefs were primitive, their gods were personifications of thunder and sun, and their myths were fanciful stories told to explain a world they couldn't possibly understand. Look at the world map of ancient memory, and a startling pattern emerges, repeated with uncanny similarity by cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. In the Andes Mountains of South America, the ancestors of the Inca spoke of Viracocha. He wasn't a god born of the mountain mists. He was a specific individual who arrived at Lake Titicaca after a catastrophic world flood. The texts describe him as a tall, bearded man with fair skin, a stark contrast to the indigenous population. He was a teacher, a civilizer. He brought knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, engineering, and the principles of law. He walked among the people, performing wonders and establishing a new order, before departing across the Pacific Ocean, promising one day to return. Half a world away in Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec told of Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan. The story is eerily the same, a bearded, light-skinned teacher arriving from the sea, bestowing the gifts of civilization, writing, mathematics and the calendar, and then leaving with a promise to come back. These aren't vague fables, they are cultural memories of a founder, an architect of their society, whose description marks him as an outsider, an other. Perhaps the most scientifically perplexing of these accounts comes from the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. For centuries, Dogon elders have passed down a sacred, secret knowledge of the cosmos. Their traditions speak of the Nommo, amphibious beings who descended from the heavens, in a vessel that spun with a deafening roar and landed with a powerful impact. Throwing up dirt and rock, these Nommo, they say, came from a star system we call Sirius. This might sound like typical mythology until you examine the details. The Dogon knew, long before modern astronomers, that the bright star Sirius A had a companion. They called it Potolo, the seed star. They knew it was invisible to the naked eye, that it was incredibly heavy and dense, and that it followed a 50-year elliptical orbit around the main star. Every single one of these facts is scientifically accurate. We now call this companion star Sirius B. It is a white dwarf, a collapsed stellar core so dense that a single teaspoon of its matter would weigh over 5 tons. Western astronomy only confirmed its existence in 1862, and its extreme density wasn't understood until the 20th century. We didn't even get a photograph of it until 1970. So how did the Dogon, a culture with no telescopes or advanced astronomical tools, possess this precise, verifiable scientific data for centuries? Their answer is simple and unwavering. The Nommo told them. They claim these beings were here to bring order and knowledge to a nascent humanity, and they left behind this stellar map as proof of their origin. This pattern of advanced skyborne teachers isn't confined to Africa and the Americas. The ancient Sanskrit texts of India, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are filled with detailed descriptions of flying machines called vimanas. These aren't just poetic flying carpets. The texts describe them as multi-tiered craft, capable of immense speed, maneuverability, and even interstellar travel. The controversial Vimanika Shastra, a text allegedly channeled in the early 20th century, but claimed to be based on far older sources, provides what appear to be technical blueprints. It discusses propulsion systems using mercury vortex engines, speaks of alloys and materials required for their construction, and describes the training of their pilots. These epics also recount devastating wars of the gods, fought with terrifying weapons. The Brahmastra, for instance, is described as a single projectile charged with the power of the universe, creating an incandescent column of smoke and fire, causing winds to blow, elephants to burst into flame, and hair and nails to fall out from those in the vicinity. The land where it was deployed was said to be barren for years, with all food contaminated. To a modern reader, this sounds less like mythology and more like a hauntingly accurate description of a nuclear detonation and its radioactive fallout. Even in the most remote corners of the globe, the same basic story is told. The Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley region of Australia have for millennia painted the images of the Wandjina, strange beings with large dark eyes, no mouths, and pale white faces surrounded by a halo-like helmet. They say the Wandjina came down from the Milky Way in the dream time, shaped the land, and taught humanity how to live. When they left, they painted their images on the rocks to serve as a reminder of their presence. These aren't stories of animal spirits or nature gods. They are specific, consistent accounts of physical beings who descended, created, taught, and then departed, from the Babylonian Apkallu, the 7 amphibious sages who brought civilization to Mesopotamia, to the Egyptian Akka, the deified horizon itself that was the gateway for the sky gods. The narrative is the same. Our ancestors weren't just making up stories to explain the lightning. They seemed to be documenting a shared global history of direct contact and tutelage by a non-human intelligence. This forces us to re-evaluate what we mean by the words God and myth. The term God, with its modern connotations of an all-powerful, all-knowing, non-physical creator, is a profoundly poor translation for what our ancestors were describing. The Sumerian word for these beings was Dingir, often depicted by a star symbol, which simply meant shining one or lofty one. The Hebrew term Elohim, as we will see, is a plural word, meaning the powerful ones. These terms denote status and origin, not divinity. The beings in these texts were not abstract. They had physical bodies. They ate, drank, held council meetings, had political disagreements, fought wars, and engaged in complex social and even genetic projects. They were not objects of worship in the modern religious sense. They were rulers, governors, and scientists. Their stories were not myths. They were civics, history, and science, all rolled into one. The idea that primitive people would invent stories of technologically advanced beings giving them the secrets to farming and astronomy is far less logical than the alternative, that they were simply recording what they saw. We, in our modern arrogance, have dismissed their history as our mythology. But if these powerful beings were real, if they truly laid the groundwork for human society and government, it begs the most important question of all: where did they go? Or, perhaps more unsettlingly, have they been here all along, their influence hidden behind a veil of power that has persisted for millennia? If these powerful teachers from the stars truly laid the foundations of our civilization and then departed, it raises an immediate and critical question. Who did they leave in charge? History doesn't record a power vacuum. Instead, from the very dawn of organised society in Sumeria, a concept suddenly appears, fully formed, as if delivered by decree, the institution of kingship. The Sumerian king lists, some of our oldest historical documents, state this explicitly. They say that after the Great Flood, kingship was lowered from heaven. It wasn't earned through battle or chosen by the people. It was a right, a technology of governance bestowed from above. This idea rippled through the ages, evolving into the divine right of kings that dominated European and Asian politics for millennia. It's a concept we now dismiss as political propaganda, a justification for absolute power. But what if it wasn't propaganda? What if it was a literal statement of fact, a memory of a political and genetic inheritance? What if the first human kings were specifically chosen, appointed, or even bred to act as intermediaries to carry on the will of the departing gods? This would explain one of the strangest and most enduring obsessions of elite families throughout history: the absolute non-negotiable imperative to maintain the purity of their bloodline. We've all heard the fairy tales like The Princess and the Pea, which we interpret as a quaint story about the delicate nature of royalty. But the real story is far more clinical and severe. It's a parable about genetic screening. The test is designed to determine if a candidate possesses the unique, intrinsic quality of the bloodline, a quality that an ordinary person could never possess. This wasn't just a story, it was policy. For thousands of years, royals were forbidden from marrying commoners. This was not merely social snobbery, it was considered a biological contamination, a dilution of something sacred and essential. The goal was to keep the bloodline pure, concentrated, and undiluted by outside genetics. This policy was pursued with such fanatical devotion that it led to catastrophic biological consequences. The royal houses of Europe became a living laboratory for the dangers of a shrinking gene pool. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite and elongated chin, became a disfiguring family trait passed down through generations of intermarriage within the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg dynasties. The condition became so pronounced in Charles II of Spain that he was unable to chew his food properly and remained largely unintelligible, a tragic symbol of a genetic line collapsing under the weight of its own exclusivity. Even more widespread was haemophilia, the so-called royal disease. Queen Victoria of England, who became known as the grandmother of Europe for her 9 children, who married into royal families across the continent, was a carrier. Through her descendants, the gene for this blood-clotting disorder was passed into the ruling houses of Germany, Spain, and, most famously, Russia. The affliction of her great-grandson, Tsarevich Alexei, became a factor in the downfall of the entire Romanov dynasty. The point is not just that these families suffered from genetic disorders. The point is why they were willing to risk crippling deformities and fatal diseases, to risk the very stability of their thrones, rather than break the one fundamental rule: do not breed outside the family. What could possibly justify such a self-destructive mandate? The desire to keep power in the family is the simple answer, but it doesn't quite capture the biological fanaticism. It suggests a deeper belief that their blood itself contained something unique, a right to rule that was not merely a social construct, but a genetic one. This obsession with bloodlines takes on a fascinating new dimension when we look at the science of blood itself, specifically the Rh negative factor. About 15% of the world's population is Rh negative. The vast majority, 85%, is Rh positive. Genetically, the Rh positive allele is dominant. The mysterious part is what happens during pregnancy. If an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive baby, her immune system can identify the fetus's blood as a foreign invader. Her body may then produce antibodies to attack and destroy the baby's red blood cells, a condition called hemolytic disease of the newborn. In the natural world, this kind of aggressive immune response between a mother and her offspring is incredibly rare. It's almost as if the two blood types are biologically, fundamentally incompatible. This has led some researchers to ask a provocative question. If all of humanity evolved from a common ancestor, where did this separate, seemingly incompatible bloodline come from? Intriguingly, the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood in the world is found among the Basque people of the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain, a population with a unique, non-Indo-European language and a genetic profile distinct from their neighbours. Could this be a faint, biological echo of a different lineage, a genetic marker left behind by an off-world population? Is the elite obsession with blood purity an unconscious, instinctual drive to preserve this ancient and anomalous genetic signature? This web of genetic connections is not ancient history. On January 20th, 1910, a photograph was taken to commemorate the funeral of Britain's King, Edward VII. It shows 9 reigning monarchs of Europe, all assembled in one room. They were the rulers of Norway, Bulgaria, Portugal, the German Empire, Greece, Belgium, Spain, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. On the surface, they were the leaders of 9 separate, independent sovereign nations. But the photograph revealed a different truth. They were all family. Through direct lineage or marriage, every single one of them was related, primarily through 2 individuals, Queen Victoria of Great Britain and King Christian IX of Denmark. 9 countries, 1 extended family. This wasn't a secret conspiracy, it was an open fact, but it forces us to re-examine what we think of as history. Was World War I, a conflict that claimed 20 million lives, truly a clash of nations? Or was it, at its heart, a catastrophic and bloody family dispute between cousins? Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Even as monarchies have faded and the era of democracy has taken hold, this strange persistence of power continues. The mainstream British journalist and broadcaster Jeremy Paxman, in his book Friends in High Places, conducted a deep analysis of the British power structure over 500 years. He charted the country's course through the Protestant Reformation, a bloody civil war and revolution, the creation of a global empire, the dawn of the Industrial Age, massive democratic reforms that gave everyone the vote, and 2 devastating world wars. Despite these seismic, society-altering upheavals, Paxman came to a stunning conclusion. The very same handful of families who were running Britain 500 years ago are, through their descendants, still at the core of the country's power structures today. The names and the faces change, but the bloodlines and the networks of influence, in banking, in law, in politics, and in land ownership, remain stubbornly intact. How is this possible? How can a system undergo such radical transformation? Yet the outcome of who holds the power remains the same. It's as if the visible political structure is just a theatrical performance, while the real machinery of control hums along, unseen, generation after generation. This unnatural persistence suggests that the elite power structure is not a product of human history, but a program running in the background, a system established long ago to ensure that control remains in the hands of a very specific and very exclusive lineage. The idea that a hidden power structure, possibly of extraterrestrial origin, has been guiding human affairs for millennia is a staggering thought. But it's a concept that suddenly crashed into the modern world on a cold night in February 1954. The story centres on a man who was, at the time, arguably the most powerful person on the planet, Dwight D. Eisenhower, 34th President of the United States and former Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. Eisenhower was on a supposed vacation in Palm Springs, California, a routine getaway for the president. But on the night of February 20th, something highly unusual happened. The president suddenly vanished from the resort. For several hours, no one in the press corps could find him. Panic began to set in. Then the unthinkable occurred. The Associated Press wire service issued a bulletin that sent shockwaves through newsrooms across the country. President Eisenhower had suffered a fatal heart attack. For a few frantic moments, the world believed the president was gone. Then, just as quickly, the AP retracted the story. A new official explanation was rushed out. The president had merely chipped a tooth on a piece of fried chicken and had been taken for an emergency dental procedure to a nearby Air Force base. The story was, on its face, absurd. A late-night emergency trip to a military base for a chipped tooth. It was a flimsy cover story that immediately aroused suspicion. And in the decades since, a different, more incredible narrative has been painstakingly pieced together by researchers, whistleblowers, and even members of Eisenhower's own family. This counter-narrative claims that there was no dental emergency. Instead, President Eisenhower was secretly whisked away to what was then known as Muroc Air Force Base, now Edwards Air Force Base. He was not there to see a dentist. He was there for a scheduled meeting, a summit of unprecedented importance. The story, leaked over the years by figures like former Naval Intelligence Officer William Cooper and Timothy Good, a respected UFO researcher, alleges that Eisenhower was there to meet with the representatives of an extraterrestrial civilization. According to these sources, this was not a first contact scenario in the way we imagine it. The beings had already been making their presence known. The massive wave of UFO sightings following the atomic bomb detonations at the end of World War II had sent a clear message to the world's powers. Our newfound ability to split the atom had, it seems, tripped a cosmic alarm bell. The beings at Muroc were reportedly of a type often described as Nordics, tall, human-looking beings with pale skin and fair hair. They allegedly came with a warning and an offer. The warning was about our nuclear path, a self-destructive technology that they cautioned would lead to disaster. They also warned of other, less benevolent species who were also present in our celestial neighbourhood. The offer was one of spiritual and technological advancement. They proposed to help humanity evolve its consciousness and live in harmony with the planet. But their offer came with a strict condition: the complete and total dismantlement of our nuclear arsenal. For Eisenhower, a military man who had just navigated the dawn of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, this was an impossible proposition. Agreeing to disarm would have left the United States vulnerable in a world teetering on the edge of global conflict. Reluctantly, the story goes, Eisenhower declined their offer. This alleged meeting then set the stage for a second, more fateful encounter. The first group had departed, but another was waiting in the wings. This second group, according to the law, was of a different biological type, one that has since become infamous in our culture: the Greys. Unlike the Nordics, this group was not concerned with our spiritual development. They came as pragmatic negotiators. They understood power and technology, and they made a different kind of offer, one that played directly to the military-industrial mindset of the time. This alleged negotiation led to what is now known among researchers as the Greada Treaty of 1954. The terms were chillingly transactional. The Greys would provide the US government with advanced technology, devices related to anti-gravity propulsion, exotic energy sources, and powerful new weapon systems. In exchange, the US government would agree to look the other way. They would allow the Greys to operate on Earth, to maintain secret underground and underwater bases, and to conduct a limited, controlled program of abducting human beings for the purpose of biological study and genetic sampling. The treaty reportedly stipulated that the Greys had to provide a list of all human abductees to a secret oversight committee, and that no permanent harm was to come to the individuals involved. It was a deal with the devil, a cold, calculated trade of human lives for technological supremacy. Initially, the idea of a treaty with an alien species seems preposterous. What leverage could a species like ours, which had just figured out propeller planes, possibly have at the negotiating table with a civilization capable of crossing the interstellar void? It would be, as one commentator noted, like a mouse negotiating with a lion over the terms of being eaten. We would have nothing to offer and no power to enforce any agreement. But this view is based on a critical misunderstanding: the assumption that we are dealing with a single monolithic alien presence. The moment you accept the possibility that the ET presence is not one group, but a multitude of different species and factions, a complex and crowded galactic community with its own politics, alliances and rivalries, the logic of a treaty snaps into focus. This is the foundation of what is called exopolitics, the study of the political relationships between our human civilization and other intelligent species in the cosmos. In such a scenario, a treaty is not just about us versus them. It's about positioning ourselves within this larger, complex political landscape. If there are multiple extraterrestrial demographics, they will naturally have different agendas concerning Earth and humanity. Some might be benevolent explorers or scientists. Others might be colonists or resource prospectors. Still others could be political or religious refugees. Some might see us as a developing species to be protected, while others might view us as a strategic asset, a biological resource, or even a pest. In this crowded and competitive environment, a treaty becomes humanity's only playing card. By aligning with one faction, we might gain protection from another. By offering one group access to our planet's unique biological diversity, we might gain the technology needed to defend ourselves against a more hostile power. The Eisenhower Treaty, in this light, was not an act of surrender. It was a desperate gambit, a strategic choice made by a leader who suddenly found himself playing a game of chess on a cosmic scale with the future of humanity as the prize he had to think through for the first time in human history, where we sit at this galactic table to best serve our interests. It was the birth of a new, secret diplomacy, one whose consequences we are still living with today. The realization that we might be sharing our world with multiple competing off-world factions transforms our understanding of history, politics, and our place in the universe. The simple question, are we alone, is replaced by a far more complex and urgent set of questions. Who are they? What do they want? And are they friends or foes? If the stories of Eisenhower's meetings are true, then humanity was thrust into a pre-existing galactic political scene, a cosmic game with rules we didn't understand. This notion isn't new. It's an echo of what our most ancient ancestors told us. The Hebrew scriptures, for instance, don't just speak of a singular God. They make frequent reference to a divine council, or a council of the Elohim. This is often interpreted metaphorically, as God consulting with his angels, but in a literal sense, it describes a governance body, a committee of powerful beings debating and deciding the fate of humanity. The Mesopotamian texts paint an even clearer picture, with the Anunnaki gods constantly holding assemblies, arguing over policy, and even fighting civil wars over their competing agendas for Project Earth. This concept of a celestial council, an intergalactic federation, is not a modern sci-fi trope. It's one of the oldest ideas in human culture. If such a council exists, it is unlikely to be a harmonious one. Any community of diverse, intelligent beings will have a spectrum of ideologies and motivations. There would be factions with vastly different views on how to deal with a developing species like humanity. Let's consider the possible demographics at this table. There might be a prime directive faction, cosmic preservationists who believe that emerging civilizations like ours should be left alone to evolve naturally without any interference. They would view contact as a form of contamination, a violation of a natural cosmic law. They might operate as silent observers, cloaking their presence and intervening only in the most extreme circumstances, such as preventing a global self-annihilation event. This aligns perfectly with the behaviour of UFOs reported around nuclear facilities. The sheer spike in sightings after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and the continued reports from military personnel of UFOs monitoring and even disabling nuclear missile silos during the Cold War, suggest a deep concern from at least one faction about our progress. The incident at Chernobyl in 1986 is a cornerstone of this theory. Multiple workers and local residents reported seeing a large, fiery sphere, a classic UFO, hovering directly over the exposed reactor 4 for several minutes on the night of the disaster. Engineers had predicted a full meltdown, a thermonuclear explosion that would have rendered a third of Europe uninhabitable for centuries. But for reasons that physicists still struggle to fully explain, it didn't happen. The core burned, but it didn't detonate with the force they feared. Did this craft actively intervene, using some advanced technology to mitigate the explosion? For those who believe in a protective faction, the answer is a clear yes. Then there would be the interventionists, but even they would be divided. On one hand, you might have the uplifters, the idealists who see potential in humanity. These could be the Nordic types from the Eisenhower Law, or the Nommo who gifted the Dogon with astronomical knowledge. Their agenda would be to gently guide our development, to share knowledge, to help us overcome our self-destructive tendencies, and to eventually welcome us into the larger galactic community. They would be our allies, our cosmic cousins, looking out for our best interests. They might communicate through telepathic contact with individuals, inspire philosophical and technological breakthroughs, and work behind the scenes to nudge our civilization toward a more positive future. The feeling of hope and connection that many contactees report could be a sign of this faction's influence. They are playing the long game, betting on our potential for wisdom and compassion. On the other side of the interventionist coin, you would find the exploiters. These factions would not see humanity as a younger sibling to be nurtured, but as a natural resource to be managed and harvested. Their interests would be purely pragmatic and self-serving. What resources could a planet like Earth offer? The most obvious is biological. Our planet is a treasure trove of genetic diversity, a cosmic library of DNA that has evolved over billions of years. An advanced civilization, perhaps one that has damaged its own genome through cloning or warfare, would see our DNA as an invaluable commodity. This provides a chillingly logical motive for the abduction phenomenon. The reports of medical-style examinations, the focus on reproductive organs, and the creation of hybrid fetuses all point to a large-scale, systematic genetic engineering program. We might be, for this faction, a living experiment or a genetic farm. Another resource is the planet itself, rare minerals, water, or perhaps even something more esoteric. Some theorists suggest that human emotions, particularly negative ones like fear and anxiety, can generate a form of psychic or etheric energy that certain beings can feed on, making Earth a kind of energetic emotional plantation. Finally, there could be factions for whom humanity is simply an inconvenience. Their interest might not be in us at all, but in the planet's strategic location in the galaxy, its unique gravitational properties, or its position relative to certain stargates or wormholes. For them, we are like ants on a patch of land where they want to build a house. They might tolerate our presence as long as we don't interfere with their operations, but they would have no qualms about brushing us aside if we became a problem. This complex web of treaties and alliances wouldn't just be between us and them. It would be a matrix of agreements between all these different factions to keep each other in check and maintain a fragile balance of power. The policy of non-disclosure, the global secrecy surrounding the UFO topic, suddenly makes perfect sense in this context. When people get frustrated and demand that governments tell us the truth, they assume the decision for secrecy is made in Washington, or Beijing, or Moscow. But what if the policy of non-disclosure is not our policy at all? What if it's a primary clause in the treaties that govern this entire situation? What if the truth is so complex, so unsettling, and involves forces so far beyond our control that revealing it would cause the entire fragile structure of our civilization to collapse? The secrecy might not be to keep us in the dark, but to prevent a widespread panic that could disrupt the delicate balance these factions have established. Our governments may not be the jailers hiding the key. They may be prisoners themselves, caught in a political reality so vast and overwhelming that their only option is to maintain the status quo and keep the public from finding out how little control they truly have. We are living in a protected space, a kind of cosmic reservation, and the walls of this reservation are built from secrets and treaties we are not even aware of. In the vast and often bewildering pantheon of alleged extraterrestrial visitors, one image has burned itself into our collective consciousness more than any other: the small, slender being, with pale grey skin, a large bulbous head, and enormous dark almond-shaped eyes. The Grey. This figure has become the pop culture shorthand for alien. It's the face on movie posters, the creature in late-night abduction stories, the universally recognised symbol of the unknown visitor. But this image is not a modern invention, a product of Hollywood special effects. Astonishingly, figures bearing a striking resemblance to the modern grey can be found in ancient art across the globe. The Wandjina rock paintings in Australia, which are thousands of years old, depict beings with large black eyes and pale, mouthless faces. Certain Sumerian statuettes show figures with oversized heads and large, slanted eyes. This ancient pedigree suggests that the Greys are not a new phenomenon. They may be one of humanity's oldest and most persistent non-human encounters. The modern understanding of the Greys is built almost entirely on the thousands of abduction reports that have been documented since the mid-20th century. From these accounts, a remarkably consistent and deeply unsettling picture emerges. Encounters often begin with the witness experiencing a sense of lost time and a strange humming or buzzing sound. The beings themselves are typically described as being 3 to 4 feet tall, with frail-looking bodies, thin limbs, and a large hairless head, dominated by those mesmerizing, opaque black eyes. Witnesses almost universally report that the eyes are the most powerful feature, that to look into them is to have your own thoughts and emotions read and understood instantly, a form of direct telepathic communication that bypasses speech entirely. This communication is often described as cold, clinical, and devoid of the emotional resonance we associate with human interaction. It's a key detail that hints at their fundamental nature. Many abductees describe the Greys as functioning with a hive mind consciousness. They seem to operate in perfect unison, without any apparent verbal commands, like a team of surgeons or, more aptly, a colony of insects. This has led to the prominent theory that many of the Greys encountered are not individuals in the way we understand the term. They may be biological robots, organic automatons, or a specially engineered worker caste. They are the cosmic equivalent of a drone, a biological tool created by a more advanced intelligence to perform specific tasks. This would explain their lack of emotion, their single-minded focus on their procedures, and their seemingly disposable nature. They are the workforce, the worker bees, sent out to do the hands-on, dirty work of collecting samples, monitoring populations, and managing the farm. The question then becomes, who is their master? Who is the queen bee? However, to label all Greys as simple drones would be an oversimplification. Researchers who have studied the phenomenon for decades, like the late Bud Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs, have noted that witness accounts describe a clear hierarchy among them. There seem to be different types of Greys. The most common are the small grey-skinned workers, but abductees often report a taller Grey, sometimes standing 5 or 6 feet tall, who acts as a leader or supervisor during the experience. This taller Grey often seems more sophisticated, capable of more nuanced communication, and appears to be directing the activities of the smaller ones. Some accounts even mention other beings present during abductions, including the human-looking Nordics, and even reptilian humanoid figures, suggesting a complex multi-species operation. This variety implies that Grey is not a single species, but a category, perhaps encompassing a range of genetically engineered or cybernetically enhanced beings, each designed for a specific function within a larger organisation. This idea of engineered species might sound like wild speculation, but it lands right at the heart of our own most ancient creation stories. The Sumerian texts and the Book of Genesis, when read literally, describe humanity itself as an engineered species. They speak of the gods manipulating the genetics of a pre-existing hominid on this planet to create a worker, the Lulu Amelu, literally the mixed worker, designed to serve them. If our own origin story claims we were genetically engineered, is it really a stretch to imagine that other, more advanced species would have mastered this technology and created various specialised races to serve their own purposes? The Greys could be a prime example of this cosmic biotechnology in action. They may be a species that, long ago, was modified by a parent race, or perhaps they took control of their own evolution, replacing frail biological parts with more durable cybernetics, sacrificing emotion for efficiency and individuality for collective consciousness. Their cosmic origin is a subject of intense debate among researchers. The most famous story, linked to the alleged Roswell crash of 1947, points to the Zeta Reticuli star system, a binary star pair located about 39 light-years from Earth. Betty Hill, one of the first well-publicised abduction cases, drew a star map under hypnosis in 1964 that she said was shown to her by her captors. Years later, an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish built a detailed 3D model of nearby stars and found a match. The map Hill drew perfectly depicted the Zeta Reticuli system, as seen from a specific perspective in space. This apparent confirmation electrified the UFO research community and cemented the link between the Greys and Zeta Reticuli. The story told is that their sun was dying, and their species, damaged by radiation and genetic degradation from millennia of cloning, embarked on a mission to find a new home, or at the very least, new genetic material to repair their dying race. Our planet, teeming with vibrant, diverse DNA, would have been the perfect laboratory. Their abduction program in this context is not an act of malice, but of desperation. A species on the brink of extinction, trying to save itself by creating a new hybrid race, one that combines their advanced mental capabilities with our robust genetic and emotional vitality. This creates a deeply complex and morally ambiguous picture. If they are desperate refugees, are they villains or are they victims? Some encounters with the Greys are terrifying and traumatic, yet others, particularly those involving the taller leading Greys, are reported to have a strange sense of purpose, even empathy. Some abductees speak of being shown visions of a dying planet, of being told that the genetic program is essential for the survival of both our species. They report a sense of profound sadness emanating from the beings. This suggests that the drone-ish workers may indeed be unemotional tools, but that the beings in charge may possess a more layered and sophisticated consciousness. They might be caught in an impossible situation, forced to perform acts that they know are traumatic for us, but which they see as a necessary evil for a greater good, their survival, and perhaps even ours. The Grey then ceases to be a simple monster. They become a tragic figure, a mirror reflecting our own potential future as a species that masters technology at the expense of its soul. When we seek to understand our origins, most of Western civilization turns to a single, foundational text, the Book of Genesis. For millennia, its opening lines have been presented as the ultimate creation story, a poetic and sacred account of how an all-powerful, singular God brought the entire universe into existence out of nothing. We are taught to read it as theology, as a spiritual allegory. The story is familiar. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This is the bedrock of faith for billions, a story of divine mystery and omnipotent power. But what if we've been reading it all wrong? What if the key to unlocking its true meaning lies not in theology, but in translation? What if this isn't a story about the creation of the universe, but a historical record of the terraforming of a planet? The first and most crucial clue is the text itself. The narrative doesn't begin with a void, an absolute nothingness from which everything is spoken into being. It begins with a planet that already exists. Before any act of creation takes place, the verse explicitly states that the earth is already here. It's not just here, it's in a very specific and troubled state. It is described as being formless and empty, and most importantly, flooded. It's a planet covered in the deep, a world of water shrouded in darkness. This is a critical detail. A story about the creation of the cosmos would logically start with the creation of space, matter, and energy. It wouldn't start with a pre-existing waterlogged planet. This simple chronological fact strongly suggests that the story isn't about the birth of the Earth, but about its restoration or transformation. The Hebrew phrase used to describe the planet's condition is tohu wa bohu. This is often translated as formless and void, or waste and empty. which sounds poetic and abstract. But in its original context, the phrase implies something far more concrete and catastrophic. It suggests a state of ruin, of devastation after a cataclysm. It describes a world that has been wrecked. The prophet Jeremiah uses the exact same phrase to describe his vision of a land that has suffered a calamitous judgment, a land returned to a primal state of chaos. So, Genesis doesn't open on an empty stage, waiting for the curtain to rise. It opens on the scene of a disaster. The earth is already here, but it is a flooded, darkened, ruined world. And it is at this moment, after the cataclysm, that the so-called Spirit of God arrives. This is where the story gets truly interesting. The text says the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The word for spirit here is ruach, and the word for God is Elohim. As we will see, Elohim is a plural word, meaning the powerful ones. And ruach, while later interpreted as spirit, has a much more physical and mechanical roots meaning. It means wind, breath, or more broadly, something that moves in the air with power. The verb used for hovering is mirahepet, which is used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe an eagle soaring and circling over its nest. It denotes a specific kind of controlled flight. So, a more literal, less theological translation of the verse would read, "And the ruach of the Elohim, the wind or the flying vehicle of the powerful ones, was soaring and circling over the surface of the waters." This is no longer a spiritual metaphor. This is a technical description. It's an image of a craft or a force arriving and surveying a flooded planet from above. This exact scenario, the arrival of gods in flying machines over a world covered in water, is not unique to Genesis. In fact, it is the standard opening scene for civilization origin stories all over the world. The Mesopotamian epics, which predate Genesis by thousands of years, begin with the Anunnaki, gods descending to a water-covered earth. Their first task is to separate the waters to create dry land. In the mythology of the Idu people of Nigeria, their creator god, Osanobua, arrives above a world entirely covered in water before beginning the work of terraforming. In the lore of the Tagalog, people of the Philippines, a sacred hawk is described hovering over the primordial sea, and the flapping of its wings creates vortices of wind that push back the waters to expose land. In South America, the Andean creator god Viracocha begins his work of civilization at Lake Titicaca, the waters of origin. The pattern is global and undeniable. Our collective ancestral memory doesn't begin with the creation of the world, but with the reclamation of a world that was lost beneath a great flood. Genesis, in this light, stops being a unique creation myth and starts looking like a Hebrew summary of a much older global story. The "let there be light" command is not the creation of light itself, but the clearing of the darkness that shrouded the planet, perhaps a dense post-cataclysmic cloud cover. The separation of the waters above from the waters below is not a mystical act, but a description of atmospheric engineering to create a stable weather system and reveal the sky. The gathering of the seas to let dry land appear is a direct account of large-scale land reclamation. This is not a story of a magical deity creating a planet from scratch. It is a story of advanced engineers, the Elohim, arriving at a devastated planet and beginning a massive terraforming project to make it habitable. But again, the Genesis account is a logbook, a summary of the stages of this planetary engineering project. The days of creation are not literal 24-hour periods, but epochs or phases in this monumental undertaking. The story we've been told is one of magic, but the story the text itself describes is one of technology. The gods of Genesis were not creators in the ultimate sense. They were landscape artists, biologists, and atmospheric scientists on a cosmic scale. The single greatest barrier to understanding the true nature of the Genesis account, and indeed many other ancient texts, is a single word: God. This three-letter word comes loaded with millennia of theological baggage. For most of the modern world, it implies a singular, omnipotent, omniscient, non-physical, perfect being. the ultimate source of all existence. When we see this word in an ancient text, we automatically project this entire complex theological concept onto it. But the original authors of these texts did not use this word. The Hebrew word that we translate as God in the opening chapters of Genesis is Elohim. And understanding the true meaning of Elohim is like finding a Rosetta Stone. For our hidden history, it unlocks everything. The word Elohim is, grammatically speaking, a plural noun. In Hebrew, the im suffix is the standard way to make a masculine noun plural. Just like adding an s in English, El is the singular form, meaning a powerful one, or a god. Elohim therefore literally means the powerful ones. This is not a controversial or fringe linguistic theory. It is a basic fact of biblical Hebrew acknowledged by virtually all scholars and theologians. The immediate question, then, is why it is consistently translated as the singular God. The standard theological explanation is that it's an example of the plural of majesty, a linguistic convention where a plural is used to emphasize the greatness of a single individual. Much like a king might say, "We are not amused." But this explanation quickly falls apart under the weight of textual evidence. Throughout the Old Testament, the word Elohim repeatedly demonstrates its plurality, not just in its form, but in its actions and grammar. The word is frequently paired with plural verbs and plural adjectives, a grammatical construction that would be highly unusual if it was simply a plural of majesty. For example, in Genesis 1:26, we find one of the most famous and baffling lines in the entire Bible. The Elohim are about to create humanity, and they say, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." This is not a singular being speaking. This is a committee. This is a group discussion. The text is unambiguous. It's a plural subject using plural pronouns to describe a collective action. To argue otherwise is to twist the language to fit a preconceived theological belief. This plurality isn't just confined to a few strange verses, it's a running theme. The Bible is filled with stories of conflict and disagreement among the Elohim. In Psalm 82, a scene unfolds in the Divine Council. It states, "God Elohim stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. Elohim." Here the word Elohim is used twice in the same sentence to refer to both the presiding figure and the group he is judging. It describes a political assembly of powerful beings, where one is calling the others to account for their mismanagement and unjust governance of humanity. This is not a picture of a single perfect God. This is a picture of a political body in turmoil. The texts describe the wars of the Elohim, showcasing jealousy, competition, and violent conflict. The primary Elohim of the Israelites, a being named Yahweh, is described as a jealous god, constantly battling against the followers of other Elohim, such as Baal, Moloch, and Asherah. Why would an omnipotent, singular creator of the universe be jealous of non-existent rivals? The narrative only makes logical sense if these rivals were real, competing figures within the same class of beings, the Elohim. So, who were they? If they weren't a singular god, who were these powerful, plural beings who terraformed our planet and debated our creation? For the answer, we must look to the cultures that came before the Hebrews. The early Israelites did not emerge in a vacuum. They were surrounded by the much older, more established civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. The Mesopotamian stories, preserved on cuneiform tablets that predate the writing of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, tell of a group of beings who came to Earth from the heavens in the deep past. They called them the Anunnaki, a Sumerian word that means those who from heaven to earth came. These Mesopotamian texts are not religious fables. They are recorded as historical annals, astronomical records, and political accounts. They describe the Anunnaki as a flesh and blood race of extraterrestrial colonists. The Anunnaki narrative is breathtakingly detailed. It speaks of their home planet, Nibiru, which is said to have a long, elliptical orbit that brings it into our inner solar system only once every several thousand years. It tells of a succession crisis on Nibiru that led a royal prince named Enki to lead an expedition to Earth on a mission to mine gold. The texts claim the gold was not for wealth, but for a technological purpose, to create a fine, monoatomic gold dust that could be used to repair the deteriorating atmosphere of their home planet. The stories name the key figures in this expedition: Anu, the king on Nibiru, his two sons, Enlil, the commander of the mission, and Enki, the chief scientist and head of Earth operations. It details their arrival, their establishment of their first base, Eridu, in what is now southern Iraq, and their struggles with the harsh conditions of a new planet. These are not abstract gods. They are astronauts, engineers, and administrators with names, personalities, and a clear pragmatic agenda. The Elohim of the Hebrew Bible appear to be a direct, though condensed and simplified, inheritance of these Anunnaki stories. The plural, powerful ones who terraform Earth and create humanity in Genesis are a perfect match for the plural, planet-altering Anunnaki of the older Sumerian accounts. The Hebrews didn't invent a new story. They adopted and adapted the history of their region, eventually focusing on the story of just one of these Elohim, Yahweh, and reframing the entire narrative around him. The moment you put the plural back into Elohim, the Bible stops being a monotheistic religious text and becomes a chronicle of paleo contact, a story of multiple competing extraterrestrial factions, vying for control over Earth and its most prized creation, humanity. By re-establishing the plurality of the Elohim and recognizing Genesis as an account of terraforming rather than creation, we can now look at the opening verses with fresh eyes. The established narrative tells us the story begins with nothing. But as we've seen, that's not what the text says. The story begins with a planet already in existence, but in a state of utter ruin, described by the Hebrew phrase tohu wa bohu. It is a world submerged in water and shrouded in darkness. The question we must ask is why? Why was the Earth in this condition? Was this its natural primordial state? Or is tohu wa bohu a description of the aftermath of some colossal, planet-altering event? The evidence, both in ancient texts and in modern science, points overwhelmingly to the latter. The story of Genesis does not begin at the beginning of the world, it begins after the end of a previous one. This idea of a cataclysm that reset the planet is not just a fringe interpretation of a single phrase. It is the central, unifying theme of over 500 flood myths from cultures all around the globe. From the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia to the story of Deucalion in Greece. From the Manu myth in India to the tales of the Maya and the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, our ancestors all shared a profound, species-wide memory of a time when the world was destroyed by water. For a long time, these stories were dismissed by mainstream science as mere fables. But in recent decades, a growing body of geological and archaeological evidence has forced a dramatic reconsideration. Scientists are now actively debating a very real cataclysm that occurred around 12,800 years ago, an event that perfectly matches the ancient descriptions. This is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The Younger Dryas was a period of abrupt, radical climate change. After a long warming trend coming out of the last ice age, the planet was suddenly plunged back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The evidence for this dramatic climate shift is clear in ice core samples and geological records. For years, scientists struggled to explain what could have caused such a rapid and violent reversal. The impact hypothesis proposes a terrifying answer: that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the Earth. The theory suggests that one or more large fragments impacted the North American ice sheet, which was still over a mile thick at the time. The kinetic energy of the impact would have been thousands of times greater than the world's entire nuclear arsenal combined. The immediate effect would have been catastrophic. The impacts would have vaporized a massive amount of ice, triggering unimaginable floods. They would have also ignited continent-spanning wildfires, throwing up a thick blanket of smoke, dust, and soot into the atmosphere. This scenario, derived from hard geological data, paints a picture that is identical to the one described in ancient texts. First, the impact would have caused the sky to go dark, shrouding the planet in a darkness over the surface of the deep. This soot layer, called the Younger Dryas black mat, has been found by geologists at sites all over the world, a thin dark line in the sediment that marks a moment of global conflagration. Second, the unimaginable heat of the impacts would have destabilised the ice sheet, causing a colossal meltwater pulse into the oceans, a global flood. This wasn't a gentle rise in sea levels. It was a series of tsunamis and deluges, on a scale we can barely comprehend, wiping out coastal civilizations and reshaping the continents. Any civilization that existed before this event, no matter how advanced, would have been almost completely obliterated, its survivors scattered and its knowledge lost. The world would have been returned to a state of tohu wabohu, a ruined, flooded, darkened planet. This scientific hypothesis gives us a new, concrete timeline, humanity's memory of a before time, a golden age that was lost, might be a real memory of the world before the Younger Dryas cataclysm. The stories of a global flood are not myths, they are eyewitness accounts of its aftermath. And this is the precise moment when the Genesis story begins. The planet is flooded and dark, and it is onto this scene of devastation that the Elohim arrive. They are not creating a world from nothing. They are arriving at a disaster zone. Their work, clearing the atmosphere, let there be light, stabilising the climate, and separating the waters to create land, is not an act of mystical creation. It is a post-cataclysmic recovery and rebuilding effort. They are a planetary rescue and engineering team. This context completely reframes our understanding of human origins. The standard model of history has a long, slow, linear progression, from primitive hunter-gatherers to civilized society. But the cataclysm model suggests a different cyclical history. It suggests the possibility of a lost, advanced human civilization before the Younger Dryas, the Atlantis of Plato's dialogues, or the antediluvian, pre-flood world mentioned in Genesis, a civilization that was wiped out, leaving only scattered survivors who were thrown back into a primitive state. The Elohim, arriving after this event, would not have been dealing with a blank slate. They would have found the traumatized remnants of a once great civilization. Their decision to make man in our image might not have been a creation from scratch out of clay, but a genetic upgrade or modification of the surviving hominids or humans. They weren't building from the ground up. They were rebuilding from the ruins, and they decided to upgrade the local workforce while they were at it. This interpretation explains why knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, law, and architecture seems to appear so suddenly and fully formed in Sumeria around 6,000 years ago, with no apparent period of development. This knowledge wasn't developed, it was delivered. It was a package of civilizational recovery, a starter kit provided by the Elohim to jumpstart humanity's second chance. The Genesis account, therefore, is not a story about the beginning of time. It is a highly condensed history of the beginning of our time, our current cycle of civilization. It's a memory that begins not with a peaceful, empty garden, but with the smoking, flooded ruins of a world that came before and the arrival of powerful beings from the sky who decided to pick up the pieces and start again. Our history is not a straight line upwards. It is a rebound from a devastating fall. If the Elohim were not spirits but physical beings arriving at a devastated planet, then the Spirit of God, hovering over the waters, was not a metaphysical presence, but something tangible. The original Hebrew word ruach holds the key. For centuries, theologians have insisted on translating ruach as spirit, breath, or soul, infusing the texts with a mystical quality. But the Hebrew language, particularly in its ancient form, is profoundly concrete and physical. It describes the world as it is seen and experienced. The primary meaning of ruach is wind, air in motion. By extension, it came to mean anything that moves through the air, or the essence of something that causes movement and life. But the idea of it as an immaterial soul is a much later philosophical development, layered onto the text by translators with a specific theological agenda. To find its original meaning, we must look at how the word is used in other, less ambiguous contexts. The most powerful example comes from the book of Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel has a series of encounters with a stunning and bizarre object that he struggles to describe. He calls it a kavod. This word kavod is typically translated as glory, as in the glory of the Lord. This translation makes it sound like a radiant light or a divine aura, but Ezekiel's description of the kavod is not abstract at all. He describes a piece of machinery. He says it arrived out of a great whirlwind, a storm cloud flashing with fire. It had the appearance of gleaming, polished metal. Hashmail, often translated as electrum or amber. It made a tremendous, deafening sound, like the sound of many waters. It had components that looked like wings that responded to voice commands, and it rested on a complex landing gear made of a wheel within a wheel, a design that allowed it to move in any direction without turning. A perfect description of an omnidirectional wheel. In fact, the design Ezekiel describes is so functional that a patent for a very similar omnidirectional wheel was granted to an inventor named Joseph Bloom in 1974. A patent later acquired and utilised by NASA for its own robotic explorers. NASA, it seems, has a patent on a component of the glory of the Lord. This kavod was not just an object to be observed, it was a vehicle. Ezekiel describes it having a platform or firmament above the wheels, and on this platform was a throne, and upon the throne was the figure of a man who piloted the craft. Ezekiel is explicitly taken aboard this kavod and flown from place to place. It was a transport device. Now here is the crucial connection. Throughout his detailed account, Ezekiel uses two words interchangeably to refer to this flying, metallic, piloted craft. He calls it the kavod, and he calls it the ruach. In Ezekiel 1:20, he says, "Wherever the spirit, ruach, was to go, they went." For the spirit, ruach of the living creatures was in the wheels. And in the next chapter, he says, "Then the spirit, ruach, lifted me up, and I heard behind me the voice of a great rushing." A few verses later, in Ezekiel 3:12, he clarifies, "Then the spirit, ruach, lifted me up, and the glory kavod of the Lord departed from its place." He is using the words as synonyms for the same object, the machine that is physically lifting him up and transporting him. This context is an undeniable linguistic bombshell. The ruach cannot be an immaterial spirit because in Ezekiel, the ruach is made of metal. It has wheels. It has seats for passengers. It has a pilot. It makes a loud noise, and it creates a powerful blast of air when it moves. There's that primary meaning of wind again. Therefore, when we go back to Genesis 1:2 and read that the ruach of the Elohim was hovering over the waters, the Ezekiel account forces us to reconsider. If the ruach in Ezekiel is a technological craft, then it is almost certain that the ruach in Genesis is also a technological craft. The spirit of the powerful ones was, in fact, the flying vehicle of the powerful ones. The image is no longer one of a ghostly presence, but of a fleet of reconnaissance vehicles surveying a flooded planet from the air, assessing the damage after the cataclysm, and preparing for the massive terraforming project to come. What's more, Ezekiel uses these terms, kavod and ruach, as if he expects his readers to know exactly what he's talking about. He doesn't say, "And I saw a strange object which I will name a kavod." He says, "I saw the kavod of the Lord," as if it were a known entity, a specific, recognised piece of technology belonging to a specific group. This implies that at the time Ezekiel was writing, around the 6th century BCE, there was a widespread, common body of knowledge about these ancient technologies. The people of his time knew what a kavod or a ruach was. It was part of their cultural history. They knew the stories of the gods and their flying machines. This was not religion. It was remembered history and technology. So what happened to this knowledge? Why do we now read these words as glory and spirit? The shift seems to have occurred during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. This was a pivotal moment when Hebrew scribes and redactors gathered their vast collection of historical texts, psalms, and prophecies, and began editing them, compiling them into the book we now call the Old Testament. It was during this process that a new, strictly monotheistic ideology was imposed upon the older polytheistic material. The plural Elohim were demoted into angels or fused into a single God, and their physical technology was spiritualized. The kavod, their shining metal craft, became the glory, a manifestation of divine presence. The ruach, their flying vehicle, became the spirit, a ghostly immaterial force. It was a systematic process of mistranslation, some of it perhaps accidental, as the original meanings of words were lost over time. But some of it, arguably, was deliberate. It was a way to take a history of physical, extraterrestrial contact and transform it into a safe, non-threatening story of a singular, spiritual God. The technology was hidden in plain sight, its true meaning buried under layers of theological interpretation. By stripping away those layers and restoring the original concrete meanings of the words, we don't just get a new theory, we recover a lost history. The realization that the early chapters of Genesis are not a creation myth, but a condensed history of terraforming by a group of advanced beings called the Elohim is a revolutionary step. But it is not the final one. To fully grasp the context of these stories, we must follow the breadcrumbs of history even further back in time. The Hebrew culture and its texts did not arise in a vacuum. They were the inheritors of a much older and, in many ways, more detailed body of knowledge from the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon. It is here in the world's oldest written texts that we find the original, unabridged version of the story that Genesis only summarizes. It is the story of the Anunnaki, the Mesopotamian accounts, painstakingly translated from tens of thousands of clay, cuneiform tablets over the past century and a half, provide a stunningly detailed prequel to the biblical narrative. These texts, such as the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and various Sumerian king lists and epics, are presented as historical and scientific records. They tell of a race of beings, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, who arrived on our planet hundreds of thousands of years ago. Their leader for the Earth mission was a brilliant scientist and engineer named Enki. His counterpart and half-brother, Enlil, was the stern commander and administrator. These were not ethereal spirits. They were described as physical beings, taller than humans, who ate, drank, had complex family dramas, fought for political power, and lived for extremely long periods of time, which our ancestors interpreted as immortality. According to these texts, their initial mission was pragmatic: to obtain gold, not for ornamentation, but to create a fine powder to seed their home planet's ailing atmosphere, a desperate act of geoengineering to save their own world. They established their first colony, Eridu, in the Persian Gulf region, and began the arduous process of mining. The story goes that after thousands of years, the lower-ranking Anunnaki, who were tasked with the back-breaking labour in the mines, mutinied. They refused to work any longer. This labour crisis presented a major threat to the entire mission. It was at a council meeting of the Anunnaki leaders that Enki proposed a radical solution. He had been studying the native life on Earth, including a particular hominid species that was evolving on the African continent, what we would today call Homo erectus, or a similar precursor. Enki's idea was to use their advanced knowledge of genetic engineering to fashion a servant for the gods. The texts describe in remarkable detail a bioengineering process. They speak of taking the essence, what we would call DNA, of a young Anunnaki male and mixing it with the ovum of a native hominid female. This process of in vitro fertilization and genetic splicing was difficult, requiring many attempts. The lead scientist on the project was a female Anunnaki named Ninhursag, also called Ninti, the Lady of the Rib, the chief medical officer. After many failures, they successfully implanted the engineered embryo into several Anunnaki birth goddesses, who acted as surrogate mothers. The result was the first successful hybrid, a new being, the Lulu Amelu, the mixed worker. This being was what we know as Homo sapiens. We were created, according to our oldest records, to be a slave race, a biological solution to a labour dispute. This Mesopotamian narrative provides the direct, explicit source material for the more cryptic account in Genesis. The plural Elohim discussing "let us make man in our image after our likeness" is a direct echo of the Anunnaki council debating the creation of the Lulu. The mysterious Adam, the first man in Genesis, is a perfect parallel to the Adapa, or the first Lulu, a being created as a hybrid of God and animal. The Genesis story of Eve being created from Adam's rib is likely a linguistic echo of a Sumerian pun. The name of the Anunnaki medical officer, Ninhursag, was also Ninti, which means both lady of the rib and lady who makes live. The biblical authors, inheriting a condensed version of the story, may have preserved the rib detail while losing its original linguistic context. The Garden of Eden, the Eden in Sumerian, was the name for the fertile plain of Mesopotamia, where the Anunnaki had their primary agricultural and command centre. Adam wasn't placed in a magical garden. He was put to work in the gods' territory. The parallels are overwhelming and undeniable. The conflicts between the Elohim in the Bible, such as the rivalry between Yahweh and Baal, mirror the intense and often violent conflicts between the two Anunnaki half-brothers, Enki and Enlil. Enki, the scientist who created humanity, is often portrayed as being sympathetic and protective towards his creation. He is the one who, in the Mesopotamian flood story, secretly warns his human favourite, Ziusudra, the original Noah, about Enlil's plan to wipe out humanity with a great flood because they had become too numerous and noisy. Enlil, on the other hand, is depicted as a strict, authoritarian commander who often views humanity as a flawed experiment that needs to be controlled or eliminated. This fundamental conflict between the two gods, one pro-humanity, one anti-humanity, is the engine that drives much of the drama in both the Mesopotamian and biblical narratives. The wars, the laws, the punishments, and the blessings described in the Old Testament are not the acts of a single, paradoxical God, but the results of a long-running political and ideological struggle between two powerful extraterrestrial factions over the future of their hybrid creation. By recognising the Anunnaki stories as the source code for Genesis, we can see that the biblical account is not an original revelation. It is a later, edited, and heavily redacted version of a much older and more complete historical record. The Hebrew scribes, in their effort to create a unified national and religious identity centered on their chosen Elohim, Yahweh, essentially took this vast, complex history of multiple Anunnaki gods and compressed it. They took the acts of the entire Anunnaki council and attributed them to a single entity. They took the story of a genetic engineering project and turned it into a story of magical creation from dust. The Mesopotamian tablets are not religious texts. They are a mix of history, science, and politics. They do not speak of an almighty, singular God. They speak of plural, advanced flesh and blood beings who are not from Earth and are not human. Genesis is the summary of this epic saga, the highlight reel of a much longer and more detailed story about our true origins as a genetically engineered species created by warring extraterrestrial colonists. We have now travelled from the whispers of sky gods in global myths to the cold, hard language of cuneiform tablets. We've seen how the plural Elohim of the Bible are a direct reflection of the earlier Mesopotamian Anunnaki, and how their advanced technology, their flying ruach and kavod, was systematically spiritualized into spirit and glory. We've uncovered a planet-wide cataclysm that reset civilization and a genetic engineering project that rebooted humanity. A new radical history of our species comes into focus, one not of slow, linear evolution, but of cosmic intervention, catastrophe, and manipulation. This forces us to confront the final and perhaps most disturbing piece of the puzzle. If this explosive history was once common knowledge, why is it now almost completely forgotten? How did a story of advanced technology and extraterrestrial politics become a story of faith and religion? The answer lies in a process of cultural suppression and deliberate mistranslation, a great forgetting that has shaped the last 2.5 millennia of human thought. The critical turning point appears to be the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian exile. The intellectual and political elite of the Kingdom of Judah were forcibly relocated to Babylon, the heart of the old Mesopotamian Empire. Here, they had direct access to the vast libraries and the full unedited histories of the Anunnaki that had been part of the cultural bedrock of that region for thousands of years. It was during this period of introspection and crisis that a group of Hebrew scholars and priests, often referred to as the redactors, undertook the monumental task of collecting and editing their own scattered scrolls and oral traditions. Their goal was not simply to preserve their history, but to forge a new, unifying national identity. They needed a story that would bind their people together and give them a unique and powerful place in the world. Their solution was both brilliant and devastating to our historical memory. They decided to build their new identity around a single supreme deity. They chose one Elohim from the larger pantheon, a warrior storm god named Yahweh, and elevated him above all others. They began a massive editorial project to rewrite their history through this new monotheistic lens. All the creative acts of the entire Anunnaki Council were now attributed solely to Yahweh. The debates and disagreements among the Elohim were edited out or reframed as Yahweh talking to his angelic servants. The competing Elohim, like Baal and Asherah, were demonized, turned from rival political figures into false gods and idols. This was a political and theological revolution. They were taking a complex history of extraterrestrial colonization and conflict and streamlining it into a simple, powerful narrative. There is only one God, he chose us, and this is his story. This process required the systematic obscuring of all overt references to technology. The kavod, the shining piloted craft, became the glory of God. A dazzling but immaterial light, the ruach, the flying vehicle, became the Spirit of God, an invisible mystical force. The Anunnaki leaders Enki and Enlil were blended and absorbed into the new singular character of the Lord God, an entity who was paradoxically both a loving creator and a wrathful destroyer. Because he was a composite of at least two different beings with opposing agendas, the genetic laboratory of Ninhursag became the magical Garden of Eden. The biological creation of a worker race became a story of breathing life into a figure of dust. Every element of advanced science and extraterrestrial reality was carefully cloaked in the new language of spirituality and metaphor. This wasn't necessarily done with malicious intent to deceive all future generations. For the redactors, it was a matter of survival. Their new monotheistic story was a powerful tool for social and political cohesion. It gave their people a sense of divine purpose and separated them from the polytheistic cultures around them. But the consequence was the creation of a profound historical amnesia, the knowledge that was once widespread, the understanding that the gods were physical beings with advanced technology was gradually lost. As the new, simplified religious story took hold, the original concrete meanings of the words faded away. Later generations, reading the edited texts, had no context for a flying kavod or a plural Elohim. They inherited the theological interpretation, and the technological reality was forgotten. Religion, in a very real sense, became the tomb of history. This great mistranslation wasn't a one-time event. It was reinforced over centuries. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BCE, the Septuagint, the plural Elohim was rendered as the singular Theos. When the Bible was later translated into Latin, the Vulgate, Theos became Deus, and from Latin it became God in English. At every step, the original plurality was intentionally erased. The entire theological infrastructure of Judaism, Christianity and Islam is built upon this foundational mistranslation. We have been taught to worship the edited, spiritualized version of beings our ancestors knew as flesh and blood colonists. We are arguing over the nature of a god who is in fact a literary composite of warring extraterrestrial politicians and scientists. The implications are almost too vast to comprehend. It means that the separation between science and religion is an artificial one, a division created by this ancient act of censorship. It means that the answers to our deepest spiritual questions may not lie in faith, but in rediscovering our lost history. The stories our ancestors left us were not meant to be read as poetry or allegory. They were desperate attempts to tell us what happened, to record the incredible and often terrifying truth of our origins. They told us we were created by powerful beings from the sky, that they governed us, that they fought over us, and that they left behind a ruling structure and a genetic legacy. We have been handed a polished, safe, and ultimately false version of our own story. The real version, the one that lies buried in our oldest texts and traditions, tells us that we are not the product of a slow, unguided evolution. We are an engineered species, living on a planet that has been a zone of extraterrestrial interest for eons. And the truth has not been lost. It has merely been sleeping, waiting for a generation, with the courage to read the ancient words for what they actually say. The story, as we've uncovered it, is not one of fantasy. It's a chain of evidence. It begins with the global collective memory of civilizing gods who descended from the sky. It connects to the unnatural persistence of elite bloodlines, obsessed with a purity that hints at a non-human origin. It erupts into the modern world with tales of diplomatic treaties signed not in smoke-filled rooms, but under the desert stars with beings from other worlds. This narrative is supported by a complex web of competing alien factions, whose agendas, some benevolent, some exploitative, explain the paradoxes of the UFO phenomenon. And at the heart of it all, we find the proof, hidden in plain sight within our most sacred texts. The words themselves, Elohim Ruach Kavod, betray their original technological meaning once we dare to scrape away the centuries of theological varnish. The story of Genesis transforms from a creation myth into a logbook of a terraforming project on a planet wrecked by a global cataclysm, a scientific event we are just now beginning to understand. The Bible's singular God dissolves back into the plural Anunnaki of the older Sumerian records, revealing a detailed history of colonization, genetic engineering, and political conflict. What has been presented as religion is, in fact, a redacted history. What has been dismissed as mythology is the eyewitness testimony of our ancestors. The implications are profound. It means our potential is far greater than we know, and the forces shaping our destiny are far more complex than we've ever been told. This is not the end of the story, but the end of the beginning. It is an invitation to look at our world, our past, and ourselves with new eyes, and to begin the real work of remembering who we are and where we came from.